So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this conversation, which is being co-hosted by Publish What You Pay, NRGI, the Natural Resource Governance Institute, and GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative. And I'm Elisa Peter, the Executive Director of Publish What You Pay. So for those of you who are not familiar with GRI, it is the independent international organization that supports reporting by companies on their sustainability practices. So companies using the GRI standard publicly disclose their most significant impacts and how they manage these impacts. On a range of issues related to, for instance, corruption risks, environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, transparency, including on taxation matters or carbon emissions. And GRI is, as of today, the most widely used global standard for sustainability reporting. So the purpose of this webinar is to present to Publish What You Pay members a new GRI initiative, which is specifically focused on the oil and gas sector. And this is the first time that GRI develops such a sector-specific standard. And this webinar is part of a consultation process to help ensure that this new oil and gas sector standard meets stakeholders' expectations. Oil and gas were prioritized by GRI for the first sector standard because of the extensive economic, social, and environmental impacts the sector can have. So this sector standard is intended to be a source of authoritative and consistent information from companies across the sector in regards to their most significant impacts. And at present, the draft sector standard identifies reporting across 22 most critical sustainability topics for oil and gas companies, covering climate change, the environment, health and safety, employment, communities, and governance, among others. So for Publish What You Pay members, this new specific GRI sector standard can be an important and complementary tool to the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and EITI reports. The oil and gas sector standard is open for public consultation until the 6th of October. So I also encourage all our audience members to provide feedback on the GRI website through the online survey. And then in parallel to that, a collective Publish What You Pay response is also being organized. So please get in touch with us at the Publish What You Pay Secretariat if you'd like to be part of this collective Publish What You Pay input into the design of the draft sector standard. So without further ado, let me introduce Pamela Carpio, who's manager for the sector program at the Global Reporting Initiative, and who will introduce the draft oil and gas sector standard with a focus on a set of issues of particular relevance to Publish What You Pay's global agenda. Let me also introduce Erika Westenberg, who's the Director of Governance Programs at NRGI, the Natural Resource Governance Institute. Erika is also an EITI board member and a member of the working group leading the development of the GRI sector standard for oil and gas. So Erika will facilitate the conversation, and we are aiming at having about, I think, 20 minutes of Q&A following Pamela's presentation. So with that, Pamela, the floor is yours for the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elisa, for setting the scene and also for making this session possible. Thank you to you as well, Erika, for having for connecting our organizations, basically, and for having been such a participant, such an active participant in the process to date. Yes, so Elisa, you have set the scene quite well. I am indeed from the GRI Standards here, and I will indeed present on the oil and gas sector standard. I also want to mention that I am joined by Mia Dadamar, which is our senior manager senior manager at GRI Standards and also the lead of the sector program. She will maybe jump in to complement a bit of the information that I will be providing, and will also be able to take in some questions when we get to the discussion session. So let's get this started. If we can move on to the slides, please. Perhaps we can move on to the slide that sets the agenda for today's session. So the next slide, please. So yes, so we're also very happy to speak with the members of the project Publish What You Pay coalition, and hopefully today, well, we wanted to propose this agenda. So we want to start by setting the context in which we are talking about the sector standard today. So we're gonna discuss a public comment period and inform you on how you can contribute to that process. Secondly, we want to provide information on GRI, the GRI Standards, and the GRI Sector Program, following on what Elisa has just said. And thirdly, we would like to discuss the pilot sector standard, oil and gas, in its approach, but also in its content. We can move to the next slide. So before we dive into the specifics, I just wanted to re-emphasize that this presentation takes place at a very key moment in its development process. The current public comment period is in fact the first time that all stakeholders are invited to comment not only on the contents of the draft sector standard, but also on the proposed approach of the GRI sector program, which is actually a new GRI program. We will have a look at what these entail in a moment, but I just want to bring your attention to the fact that all the content that will be presented today is therefore open to comments from you. The draft and the related public comment online survey are available on our website until the closing date for the public comment period, which is on 6 October, so something like 2 weeks from now. We'll make sure that you have the hyperlinks to access those after this presentation. And we very much invite you to submit your comments also through the course of the session today, obviously. Please feel free also to ask any clarifying questions that would help you prepare your submission. I'm not sure if we have mentioned it, but perhaps you already noticed that there's a chat function in your Zoom webinar pop-up that you can use, and we will be monitoring it so we can address your questions when we come to the discussion. Next slide, please. So let's start with a bit of background. So who is GRI? So as mentioned by Elisa, we are an independent international standard setting organization, and we help businesses understand and report their sustainability impacts through the use of the GRI standards, which we provide freely and as a public good. GRI has been active for a little bit more than 20 years already, and the GRI standards are the most widely adopted sustainability reporting framework. And they are meant to be used by organizations of all types, sizes, and geographic location. Next slide, please. The GRI standards now, they include a robust multi-stakeholder process. So to ensure that they represent global best practice and enhance comparability and quality of information produced by those standards. So here you can see that the constituencies that are included in the process, in the development process of the GRI standards include civil society, business enterprises, mediating institutions, labor organizations, as well as investment institutions. We can move to the next slide, please. So if we Now take a closer look at the system of the GRI standards. You can see on the screen that there are three sets of standards. The universal standards on the left apply to organizations reporting in accordance with the GRI standards, basically to all, it's the entry point to the GRI standards. These standards refer to how to use the standards, the organizational and contextual information, and how to identify and report on an organization's material topics. Please note that these standards are currently under review. In fact, they have just closed their own public comment period a few weeks ago. The revisions that they proposed related to better alignment to human rights international instruments and to the inclusion of the sector standards into the system of the GRI standards, to highlight just a few of the revisions proposed. The sector standards now in the middle of the image, yes, thank you, are meant to provide information on the most likely material topics for organizations in a given sector. Again, we will come back to this, but please note that the sector standards are a new program to GRI and that we are thus in a pilot phase with the oil and gas sector standard. With the input that we will receive during this public comment period, we will shape the approach, format, and language of the sector standards, and then look at scaling the coverage to other sectors. Finally, on the right, you see that there are topic standards, actually 36 different topic standards, and these include disclosures to report on specific topics ranging from economic performance, tax, waste, employment rights, indigenous people, etc. Our focus today will thus be the middle piece of this image, and particularly the draft sector standard, oil and gas. We can move to the next slide, please. Just wanted to provide a little bit more information on the purpose of the sector program, because it is a new program for GRI. So the sector standards, which are developed under the sector program, was launched with the objective of providing clarity on which topics constitute a sector's most significant impacts from a sustainable development perspective. And the program aims to create a firm foundation for improved transparency and for more consistent reporting from organizations in the same sector, and thus focusing on the issues that matter most. Beyond the sector standards themselves, the sector program is also intended to surface emerging topics for the future development of topic standards. Next slide, please. And so if we have a closer look at the development of the sector standards, we can see that it is overseen by the Global Sustainability Standards Board, which is GRI's independent standard setting body, and that it follows due process protocol. The content of the sector standards is based both on stakeholder input, on existing research, and authoritative references. A multi-stakeholder expert working group drawn from around the world and representing the diverse constituencies of GRI has also been convened to develop this sector standard. And I want to acknowledge Erica's participation to the development of the sector standard oil and gas through this project working group. I think additionally, what I also want to mention here is that there is a particular emphasis on the research component for developing sector standards in order to evidence the impacts described in the standard. So we can move to the next slide, please. So how will these sector standards work? So depending on the evolution of the GRI Universal Standards, which we just saw a few slides ago, the sector standards will also continue to evolve, especially when related to the implementation approach. However, in their current form, which you may have seen already, the GRI sector standards are intended to do the following. Firstly, to describe the context for a sector from a sustainable development perspective. Secondly, to outline the topics that are likely to be material for an organization in a given sector and based on the sector's most significant impacts. And thirdly, help organizations determine what to report by listing appropriate disclosures to report on these topics. Next slide, please. So the approach to the sector standards is anchored and mandated by the universal standards. Let's have a look a bit at this interaction. The draft universal standards currently require an organization reporting in accordance with the GRI standards to identify its material topic and to use the sector standard applicable to its sector when this one is available and when doing its materiality assessment. Just a note here that material topics in the GRI standards are the topics that reflect an organization's most significant impacts. And an organization identifies its material topics based on those impacts, basically. As an interaction, the sector standard, oil and gas, includes, or as a response to that, the sector standard includes a list of 22 topics that have been identified by our project working group as likely to be material for organizations in the oil and gas sector. We'll have a closer look at those topics in a second. Secondly, the universal standards also require organizations to identify appropriate disclosures to report on these material topics. And in response to that, the sector standard therefore includes what to report sections following each topic descriptions. And those sections include disclosures that have been identified as appropriate to report on the impacts under each of these 22 topics. So we can move to the next slide. So yes, we can move directly into the content. So firstly, just to clarify to which organization and activities the standards applies to. It lists, so the sector standard lists groups of oil and gas organizations operation throughout the up, mid, downstream, and downstream value chain, as well as activities that underpin the most significant impacts of the sector. In this standard, those activities range from exploration, development, and productions to sales and marketing. Besides these activities, the sector description also denotes the business relationships of particular relevance for this sector, namely joint ventures, state-owned enterprises, and suppliers and contractors. This means that all these activities and business relationships described here are related to the most significant impacts of the sector and merit consideration when identifying material topics and reporting. So similarly to other GRI standards, this standard is intended to be used by organizations in the oil and gas sector, regardless of their size, type, or geographic location. We can move to the next slide. The sector context is a front section in the sector standard, and it aims at setting the scene. So it provides clarity to organizations on how to understand and report their impacts in the wider context of sustainable development. It describes the oil and gas role in society and sustainable development, which include, for instance, providing energy and raw materials needed for development purposes, but also contributes to climate change, corruption, and other negative impacts. So the sector context includes references to authoritative instruments such as the work of the IPCC, the Paris Agreement, and the Sustainable Development Goals, to name just a few. We can move to the next slide. So this slide now shows the list of 22 topics that have been identified by our project working group as likely to be material for an organization in the oil and gas sector. These topics have been identified mainly on the basis of the sector's most significant impacts. So in practice, this means that an oil and gas organization that would want to use the GRI standards would thus need to review each topic listed in this sector standard, so this list, and determine whether these topics are material to report on. Although this list is an input to their materiality assessment, it is not a substitute for a materiality assessment. So an organization is still required to assess independently what topics are material to report on. This is an input. So perhaps interesting for you to know and for us as well is whether this group thinks that this is reflective of the most significant impacts of the oil and gas sector, and whether you think this list is complete or we are missing a few topics. But we can, of course, come back to that discussion when we get to a more interactive part of this session. We can move to the next slide. This slide is just to show you how each of these topic descriptions are structured. So for each likely material topic listed in the standard, the description first starts with a description of the significant impacts and how they occur. So basically why a topic might be material. Additionally, in some cases, experts in the project working group considered that performance related to certain activities could be of particular relevance when reporting. In such cases, there are call-out boxes that have been included to the text in order to highlight these activities. The example that you see on the slide is from the topic of anti-corruption. And in this case, the project working group highlighted the importance of transparency on contracts and ownership structures for reporting. Finally, the topic or each topic descriptions is followed by a what to report section. And this is the section that lists disclosures that have been identified as appropriate for reporting on the topic. And the principle is that these mainly originate from the GRI standards. However, in some cases, additional disclosures from other non-corresponding topic standards or external sources to GRI are included in this sector standard, and this is only when needed for more complete reporting. We can move to the next slide. We'll now take a deeper look at a selection of topics, and before we do that, I just wanted to highlight that the project working group and the experts consulted to date have identified that climate change related topics are of key relevance for this sector, and in fact, probably the most important topics to report on. Beyond the sector's contribution and expectations towards mitigation and transition efforts, climate change related topics were seen as a multiplier or of other impacts described throughout the standard. For instance, while the sector will increase the pace of the transitions towards a low carbon economy, possible negative consequences for workers and local communities that are dependent on the sector's continued activities could amplify. So climate change impacts are currently represented in two topics within the sector standard, and these are GHG emissions and climate resilience and transition. Let's move to these topics specifically. So GHG emissions deals with reporting the different types of GHG emissions, including through flaring and venting, as well as scope 1, 2, 3. So just to give you this, what you see on the slide is just a summary of the information that is requested within this sector standard for this topic. But to provide a bit of a broad commentary here, the information requested relates to efforts to move towards less GHG intensive operations and the management of flaring and venting. It also requests information on how goals and targets are set and to which activities or business relationships they apply, as well as their baseline and timeline. There's also additional reporting recommendations on energy consumption and intensity, scopes 1, 2, 3, GHG emissions, their intensity and their reduction targets. And there's also information requested on methane emissions and a breakdown of emissions per source. We can move to the next slide. Climate resilience and transition addresses perhaps the most strategic side of the climate change topic. It seeks information on how oil and gas organizations on their approach to current and future anticipated climate risks and hazards, and consider the idea of a just transition towards a low carbon economy. Again, in a nutshell, and we're happy to take questions on this later when we come to the discussion, but the information that is prompted here relates to the accountability within the organization for climate change, and whether and how this is translated in internal policies regarding performance assessment and remuneration, for instance. It also requests information on an organization's approach to public advocacy on climate change. Regarding goals and targets on scope 3 emissions of sold products, it requests information on what strategy is used to achieve the targets, their baseline, their timeline, and whether these are informed by scientific consensus or authoritative instruments. There's also additional information requested on organizational activities regarding the past and projected production of oil and gas and renewable energy and related investments. So the percentage of total capex and current total revenue. It also prompts information on reserves and their emission potential. Finally, beyond requesting information on the financial implication and other risks and opportunities due to climate change, reporting recommendation prompt information about the strategy setting process in light of a just transition. For instance, organizations can report on their use of scenario, decisions not to invest, investment in nature-based solutions, and technologies to remove carbon. If we move to a different area of topic and look at the next slide, which is on diversity and non-discrimination. Firstly, this topic recognizes these as fundamental human and labor rights. It also addresses impacts from discrimination and how they occur in the oil and gas sector. For this topic, the information that's requested from organizations relate to the diversity representation within governance bodies and employees. It also prompts information on wages per gender, training per employee, and proportion of senior management that is recruited locally. And it also requests information on incidents of discrimination and corrective actions that have been taken. We can move to the next slide. In terms, this topic of economic impacts relates and requests information on the direct and indirect impacts that oil and gas activities can have on the economic systems in which they operate, and how local communities, regions, or nations can be affected when the economic activity from oil and gas ceases. As such, organizations are requested to provide information on the economic value generated and distributed by country, region, and project, the employment and procurement opportunities, and also their infrastructure investment is also are also metrics that are requested to disclose on. we can move to the next slide, which is quite complementary to economic impacts. So local community impacts on its side addresses perhaps the social, cultural, and environmental impacts that an oil and gas organization can have on persons or communities that are likely to be affected by its operation. And as such, it requests information on engagement processes, identification of vulnerable groups, on impact assessment, including exposure to hazardous substances impacting the environment and human health, as well as information on grievance mechanisms and disputes. We can move to the next slide. The topic of anti-corruption describes corrupt practices and how they could occur in the oil and gas sector. And there is a special highlight here on contract transparency and ownership structures, as they have been identified as relevant for reporting for this sector. So in line with these impacts, the reporting sections request information on which operations have been assessed for risks, on communication and training provided by the organization to the staff, as well as the organization's policies on the topic and incidents of reported corrupt practices. It also prompts organizations to disclose information on contracts and beneficial ownership along the corresponding EITI requirements. I'm not sure if here in this for this topic, if Erica would like to come in and perhaps comment a little bit more. Otherwise, I can go on and discuss payment to government as well as public policy and lobbying.
Yeah, I think it's fine to keep going. Thanks for highlighting the EITI linkages here. That'll be of particular relevance to a lot of Publish What You Pay Coalition members who engage quite a bit with EITI. And actually on this call, I can see we have several other EITI board members. So thanks for flagging that on this issue. And I know it'll come up in some of the other topics you discuss as well.
Perfect.
So please go ahead, thanks.
Perfect, thank you, Erica. So then I will, we can continue on to next slide to look at payment to governments. This topic addresses taxes, production rights, royalties, and other types of payments to governments for which a lack of transparency can result in inefficient management of public funds or illicit financial flows and corruption. The description draws attention to the specific impacts related to state-owned enterprises and first sales too. So in addition to requesting information on direct value generated and distributed and disclosures on tax practices, there is also information requested on the state's share of production and level of disaggregation, also in line with the related EITI requirements. For this topic, there is also a special request of information to state-owned enterprises to disclose information on the level of state ownership and financial relationship as per related EITI requirement. Lastly, the last topic we probably wanted to present for this audience is, we can move to the next slide, relates to public policy and lobbying. So this one really refers to an organization's participation in public policy, either directly or through memberships that they might have. And it requests information on their monetary participation to organizations that would have activities in public policy, but also it requests information on public policy, on their own public policy positions and their internal related policies. This also highlights the organizations or prompts the organizations to disclose their own position on climate change. So I think I've these are more or less the topics that we want to present to you today. My next slides relate a little bit more on what are the next steps for the current public comment period, but also for the sector program at GRI in general. So this is just to remind you that you are welcome to submit your comments. You have hopefully had a bit more of a flavor of what is included in the sector standard at the moment, and also have a bit more of a sense of what the proposed approach for a sector standard is in this case. And we just want to, again, welcome you to take a look and submit your comments, and you can do so by 6th of October, which is Tuesday, I think in 2 weeks. We will make sure that you have all the necessary links and web pages so that you can effectively have a look at that. And if we move to the next slide, we also wanted to inform you that of course, the sector program, we are now in the pilot phase. Oil and gas is one of the pilot projects that is currently being deployed, but we have other pilot projects as well underway. So we are also looking at we are developing as well in parallel a sector standard for coal and another one for agriculture and fishing. What we can say is that the prioritizing of the sector standard development is led by the significance of the impacts of a certain sector, and that yes, we invite you to watch that space as we will continue on deploying the program. And I will hand it over to Erica in this case to moderate the next part of this presentation.
Thanks so much, Pamela, for that really very comprehensive overview on the GRI itself and on the draft oil and gas standard. I think for the audience, as you can see, the draft standard has some really important linkages with numerous Publish What You Pay campaigns and the work of many Publish What You Pay coalition members. So we have some time now for questions to the GRI team. These can be questions of clarification or more information on the substance of the draft or regarding the process for developing the standard and next steps. But I did also want to flag that this is also an opportunity to provide feedback on the topics covered in the standard itself in the context of the public comment period. As Elisa mentioned, I know there are plans underway for written feedback, and I think that's really important, but this is also another avenue to provide some feedback as well. So we have a few questions already in the chat. And let me first go to a few that are around kind of the scope of sector coverage. So we have one question that's around what informed the decision to focus on oil and gas only rather than also including the mining sector. And I think there was a similar question on why not consider coal together with all solid minerals. So maybe if you want to take a first pass, Pamela, on the kind of sector scope questions.
Pam, do you want me to come in on this one?
Yes, that would be great. Thank you, Mia.
Sorry, Erica, just to butt in, but maybe.
Yeah, thank you.
So yeah, thank you for that question. So actually, ultimately, at the moment, the objective of the program is to cover around about 40 sectors. And of course, there's many ways that you can cut up what these sectors are. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is identify likely material topics. And the reason that they're likely is because there could be unique circumstances for an organization where some of those topics aren't material, but we need the sector to be, I suppose, narrow enough that the likely material topics are material for a large portion of the scope, the sector that's scoped out. And actually the original plan was to have oil, gas and coal co-located in a single sector, and this decision was made obviously in relation to the impact that oil, gas and coal have on climate change and the sort of transition that those two sectors are going through. Ultimately, we found, and they have, of course, a lot of other shared characteristics, being sort of large industrial mining ventures of some sort, but or extractive ventures of some sort. But ultimately, we found that the transition pathway of these two sectors meant there wasn't continuing support for them to be co-located, so we decided to split them. The reason at the moment that we haven't then added coal to mining, and just to pick up on that, there will be a mining sector standard that is actually next or in the next few off the rank, so it is a priority sector. But the reason that coal now hasn't been added to mining is because in a similar vein, we were concerned that it would lose some of the emphasis on the climate change issue if it was added into the general mining sort of standard. And of course, the potential transition or that mining companies are taking versus coal mining companies away from high emission activities is likely to be a little bit different. So that's the reasoning so far. And of course, we might not have got this perfectly right. And we still take comments on those scopes while we're in this public comment phase. We welcome that as well.
Thanks very much, Mia, for that. We have another set of questions that is around this kind of relationship between the GRI standards and sector standards like the EITI. So this is kind of a combination of questions from Elisa and also Elena. Essentially, we know the EITI is a key disclosure standard that many of us engage with. It would be great to kind of get your sense or response in kind of how the GRI standards complement EITI disclosures, and from Elena kind of also flagging this point of, you know, often companies complain that they have multiple reporting mechanisms that they have to comply with. Are there efforts beyond kind of cross-referencing things like EITI standards and SDG and Paris commitments? Are there other ways to kind of synchronize implementation around these various reporting standards?
Sorry, I might jump in again and then see if Pam wants to add anything. But yeah, so I think there are obviously there's some complementary aspects, but I would say at the end of the day, some of the objectives, I suppose, of GRI or what GRI is causing an organization to produce is slightly different to what EITI is you know, resulting in. I mean, the GRI standards are fundamentally standards that are used by an organization in their annual reporting, basically. That's the most common use. So it's to produce a sustainable development report or some sort of sustainable development reporting that goes along with their financial reporting. So in that way, I would suggest the level of transparency that is being asked for in GRI is slightly different to what's being asked for in EITI. So perhaps if we talk about, well, an example that you and I have talked about, or you and Pam have talked about, Erica, say contract transparency. Generally, EITI might ask organizations to disclose contracts, while GRI was asking the organization, do you have a policy of disclosing contracts, and where can those contracts be found? That's not always the case. Sometimes there may be absolute direct crossover, but it can be a slightly different, or what proportion of the contracts are you disclosing, for example. So it's more that sort of annual reporting style of disclosure. I think EITI, and obviously EITI has a role around country aggregation of information as well, which GRI doesn't have a role in. And so there is some complementary aspects to that. We provide perhaps a little insight into how organisations are operating in relation to EITI, which is maybe accessible to many different types of stakeholders because it comes in their annual reporting. There was one other thing which I've now forgotten that I was going to pick up on. I'm sorry, so maybe I should leave it there. Pam, is there anything I've left out?
No, I think you touched upon the major point. I think I was just going to reinforce that when we, the reason why we are reinforcing or at least, referring to EITI is obviously to make this to align with normative practice in terms of reporting. So I think that's an important point out there. We don't want to add to the burden, but basically make it as simple as possible for reporters to use also the GRI and use the EITI. And I think that also given the scope, the perspective from GRI Standards, which is to address sustainable development from the inside out, let's put it like this. It also perhaps is complementary to the ITI in terms of the scope of information that can be disclosed by the use of both frameworks.
And if I can just add, thanks very much, Mia and Pamela, for that answer. I think another important angle in terms of EITI linkages and in terms of kind of publish what you pay campaigns and forward-looking is that the GRI draft standard goes further than EITI does on issues related to climate, on GHG emissions. These are things that in the EITI context, we're still pushing for. So there's, from a kind of advocacy perspective, I think there's a real opportunity here to, the flag has been planted, and there's a real opportunity to say that from the perspective of synergies and harmonization, that the EITI actually needs to catch up in that respect around some of the climate-related disclosures. So I think that's another important point in terms of that linkage. One kind of related point, I guess, that somewhat flows from the EITI discussion is a question I see from Miles around the payment to governments reporting and whether it was a conscious decision to not reference mandatory payments reporting under EU, Canadian, Norwegian, and UK law. I can start if that's helpful. There was quite a bit of discussion on this point, and the reference point that we essentially went with was the EITI project level reference point, because as many of you know on the call, that was the product of many years of negotiation, and the sense was that it encompassed kind of an EU definition and scope that we were comfortable with and seemed consistent. So I can say from the kind of in the perspective of civil society members who were participating in the working group, that was very much kind of the thinking. I'm not sure if you meant, Miles, in terms of referencing other authoritative sources, because there is kind of that additional kind of annex with various authoritative sources listed. I'm not sure if you meant that. That perhaps is something we should consider, making sure they're at least referenced there. But hopefully that provides a bit of the kind of background strategy thinking on that point. I'm not sure if Mia or Pamela want to add anything on that.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. Thanks. I think it's also just a bit of a general struggle that we have in the GRI standards. I recently came off working on GRI's tax standard, which is a topic standard. And of course, there are certain countries that are well ahead in terms of what they require reporting on tax. And of course, some sectors that are well ahead in terms of reporting on tax or other payments to government. So I think one of the things we struggle with is that the GRI standards have a basic philosophy that they need to be sort of globally applicable, also applicable. When I look at the topic standards, it says things like size agnostic, sector agnostic, of course, geographic location agnostic. Of course, we're not sector agnostic here because we're talking about sectors. But so we do struggle sometimes when there's a key leading practice, but it's only existing in a few individual countries now, and we often discuss how broad it has to be. Like, for example, is the EU broad enough to bring it into a global standard as a reference? So those are some of the discussions that happen. I think if there's value in referencing the fact that these exist in certain places, that could be something that we could consider in the sector standard. But how we would select which geographic location to sort of elevate, I'm not sure, but certainly something to discuss.
Yeah, definitely agree. And obviously for Miles and the many other folks on the call who work a lot on these project level reporting issues, I think for the comments that are submitted, any feedback on how it can be further nuanced and kind of framed, I think that's one where that would certainly be valuable. The two remaining questions that we have right now in the chat, although others please feel free to add to the list, are kind of around this issue of companies being validated or assessed for their, I don't want to say compliance, but for how comprehensive their reporting is or how obligatory versus voluntary it is. And if I could add kind of an additional component to that question, because so many Publish What You Pay Coalition members are doing advocacy, are working on holding companies to account, is there any advice that you would give on if we look, once the standard is out and we look at company reporting and it seems that a topic that should be very material has been omitted in that company's self-assessment of what is material, are there strategies for how to tackle that and hold companies accountable for the scope of their materiality?
Great question. I don't know if I have all the answers, but I can say that it's one of the objectives of the sector program is to help in this dialogue or this advocacy. So part of the point of sort of articulating what the likely material topics are for organizations in a particular sector is to say to them, hey, this group of people from multiple constituencies, business, you know, all these 5 constituencies, they have come together and basically agreed, validated that these are broadly the likely material topics that someone from your sector should be reporting on. And so that actually opens up the opportunity to more clearly ask the question of, well, why haven't you reported on one of these topics here? Now, there could be a completely valid reason, right? Maybe the geographical location means that it's not something that is an impact for this organization. But it's supposed to present a dual purpose. And on that side, one of the things that all organizations have also said they struggle with is to have a starting place for their materiality process. So there's a lot of description about how an organization might identify material topics, but a lot of, like we obviously do a bit of comparison at the beginning of these projects. And it's pretty surprising when you're talking about a fairly mature industry in terms of reporting, you're talking about pretty big organizations, the difference between the material topics being reported in different sustainable development reports. And you think, how could this possibly be that that one over there is completely different to this one over there, and there's no sort of commonality in terms of topics selected? So we hope this actually becomes a tool that can actually be used to engage with organizations and say, okay, well, you only reported on 4 out of the 22. What is that? So certainly that would be the first starting point. I hope that as we go through this process, we can aid in perhaps, you know, providing more advice around that. But I mean, engaging with companies in advocacy, I'm sure you guys know a lot more than we do, but that's certainly one of the purposes. And we've seen for certain topics in the past, it's very powerful. So again, I said tax, you know, we're now having these conversations to say, well, this was agreed to by a bunch of people, not just from civil society, not just from investors, not just from labor, but from this multi-constituency sort of process. And can I just quickly add to that something about the voluntary nature of GRI? So at the end of the day, in most places, sustainable development reporting is voluntary and the use of GRI is voluntary. But we are used by thousands of organizations worldwide. And we think, I mean, the statistics are always a little bit rough, but we think around about 75% of the 250 largest organizations in the world use the GRI standards to develop their sustainable development reports or equivalent thereof. So this is something that has a very broad application. And yes, organizations are always choosing whether they want to enter into the GRI system or not. But if they do decide to use GRI, they will be under an obligation to at least consider the material topics that are being presented to them and hopefully be convinced by what is being written in the standard. So I just wanted to close off on that point as well.
Thanks so much, Mia. And that's really useful to know kind of that is expressly part of the mandate of the GRI sector team in terms of engaging with companies around the scope of their reporting. That's great to know. And to your point on kind of the companies that at least say they do GRI reporting or reference GRI standards, I can say that was a big part of the reason that at NRGI we decided to engage with this process. When we did our internal kind of mapping of companies that our country teams cared about, we found that a significant percentage of them at least referenced GRI standards in terms of what they said they engaged with. So that made it something that we thought was kind of worth time investing in. So I think it's clearly important for our sector, hopefully even more so now with the sector standard. One last question that's come up, if folks have a few extra minutes, I know we're slightly over time, and it's from Caroline asking around, that it's good that the GRI standard goes further on climate change disclosures, but asking why there isn't an explicit mention on production decrease and phase out in absolute terms, as opposed to in terms of intensity, which is mentioned. So I guess in terms of kind of the absolute move away from fossil fuel. So I don't know if you want to, either of you, address that at all.
Yes, I think this is also something we can follow up on, perhaps by writing as well, if we don't get to the full answer. But I think that in the context of this sector standard, the emphasis is put on the transition to a low carbon economy, and this is what is currently reflected in the sector standard. And I think that when we look at the topic of, for instance, climate resilience and transition, so it discusses adaptation of companies to the risks of climate change, not only the financial implications, but obviously what this means in terms of their strategy towards moving along to a low carbon economy. So in this sense, there are disclosures here that request companies to have a look at their climate scenarios, at their reserves, the potential emission potential of the reserves, and so all of these sort of future-looking metrics that could inform the strategy that they are adopting now in order to transition. I hope I don't want to take more time, and I'm happy to provide more info.
Just to add to that, and it's not going to be technical, but I think these type of comments are what we're looking for, particularly for those disclosures that are extra in the sector standards. So Pam talked about, well, some come from existing topic standards and some are additional, particularly relevant to this sector or perhaps emerging areas or just gaps we have in the topic standards. And these are the types of things that we want to understand as part of the public comment. We're always balancing what's the most valuable information against how much effort it takes to produce it, against, all the different factors. So if it's that both elements are needed, then that should be considered by the project working group following the public comment. So, these are the types of things I think we want to hear about and be able to present back to the working group for discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Pamela and Mia, so much for your overview of the standard, for your responses on the questions. Really looking forward to continuing this work, and thanks really just as a member of the working group for all your support and engagement throughout the process. It's been really valuable, and appreciate your making time to talk today, and for all of the participants for joining. Thank you very much. We'll end it there.